let me show you another little chart here, which is resources for war, okay? And Janap in the book has another chart of this. Everybody does this. Every textbook has something like this. It's obvious the North is going to win, right? They're way ahead. Look, 22 million versus 9 million population, which included 3.5 million slaves. Factories, gigantic number, very few in the South. Value, railroad track mileage, textile, firearms production. There was no firearms production in the South really before the Civil War. They had to build up an industry. The value of in other words, the resources of modern war, the North had a tremendous advantage, right? So some people just say, well, therefore their victory was inevitable. Northern victory was inevitable. You can just look at it. But of course, if you think about it, you realize war is not fought on a chart. War is fought on a field, and very often the stronger side does not win. Who can give me an example of a war where the stronger side did not win? Yes. Thank you, exactly. The War of Independence. You could do the same thing for Great Britain versus the 13 colonies, and it would be even more unbalanced. And in fact, George Washington lost every battle until the last one. And why did the British stop? They had armies, they had navies. Why did they stop after Yorktown? Because the will to fight ended, because the British public, the British political system, no longer was willing to conduct the war. Washington was winning as long as he kept an army in the field, despite losing battles and despite the tremendous manpower advantages and resources of the British. And there are many others. Vietnam is another one where the United States poured billions and billions of dollars, aircraft, hundreds of thousands of troops against a much smaller and weaker enemy and still lost the war. So this is not the whole story for the war. Obviously, it's better to have more resources on the other side, but it doesn't guarantee anything. In fact, Janap has this article in there this week from the London Times predicting Confederate victory. Many people thought actually the advantage lay with the South, not with the North. Forget about all this. General Beauregard, one of those guys who was a street in Alexandria, said, "No people ever fought for independence with more advantages than the Confederacy." No one ever fought with more advantages. First of all, they were fighting for independence, which is something that galvanizes people and inspires them. They were on their own ground, their own territory. Frederick the Great of Prussia once said, this is quoted about, if I were mindful only of my own glory, I would always make war in my own country. For there every man is a spy, and the enemy can make no movement of which I am not informed. Fighting on your own ground, of course, leads to destruction, but you know the territory, you know what it is. Even you have what they call interior lines of communication. The further the Northern Union troops went into the South, the longer their lines of supply, the more difficult it was. It's very hard to conquer a giant, the South, the Confederacy is as big as Western Europe. It's not so easy to conquer an area that big, no matter how many resources you have, and then to hold it. In fact, some people say, why did the South stop fighting in 1865? How come they only fought for 4 years? What kind of war of independence is this? I had a good friend that unfortunately passed away, African-American historian Armstead Robinson, who wrote a very good book about the Civil War. He used to go around giving lectures. He taught in the South to the daughters of the Confederacy, and he would say, you guys fought a pretty lousy war. Not you guys, your ancestors. What is this, giving up after 4 years? What kind of fight for national independence? The Dutch fought for 80 years against the Spanish. The Vietnamese fought for like 50 years against the French or 30, 40, whatever it was, the French and the Americans. The American Revolution lasted 8 years. How can you give up after 4 years? That's ridiculous. What kind of war is that? So the main point is this. The South fought on the defensive. The South did not have to conquer the North. The North had to conquer the South. That simple fact erases this entire thing. Forget about it. Irrelevant. Because the task of the North was far greater than the task of the South. The South did not have to invade New England. The South did not have to conquer Ohio. They simply had to be on the defensive, which is always a better, you'll see in a minute, a much better way to fight. So let's, this is the United States in 1861. The blue states are the Confederacy, after the top four, so from Virginia south. That is a vast area, a vast area. It's not so simple to win a war which requires exerting your authority over such a gigantic area of territory. The South it had fewer men, it needed fewer men. It requires far more men to do what the North had to do than what the South. It had these shorter lines of communication, as I said. It had few important cities, targets. What is the Army supposed to do? You know, just marching around in the countryside doesn't accomplish all that much. The further the Northern troops went into the South, the more they were exposed to kind of guerrilla type attacks on their supply lines, attack on their rear. One of the things the North tried to do is, what they say, create a Confederate rear, somewhere you didn't have to confront them head on, but there was none because of the way the North had to, you know, move into the South. In view of these real advantages that the Confederacy had, some historians have said, well, obviously, the real difference between North and South was political leadership. David Potter, a great historian, in an often quoted sentence, made this explicit. He said, if the North and South had exchanged presidents, the South would have won the war. So it's not military technology, it's not manpower, it's political leadership. Lincoln was a successful political leader, Jefferson Davis wasn't. That's why the North won the war, according to David Potter. The main point is the result was not inevitable. If you think it was inevitable, there's nothing to discuss. If you look at that chart, hey, they had all this technology and manpower, then there's nothing to discuss. They had to lose. The South had to lose. If you think it wasn't inevitable, you must find other explanations for Confederate defeat, which has sort of taken up the time of historians for a long, long time and continues to do so.